one explanation for why the mental health conditions are stigmatized is to say that they show us something true about ourselves and the world that we live in that we don't want to know about. So in other words, when we are suffering from the neurotic mental health conditions, and I'll go into the question of the psychotic mental health conditions at another point, we're no longer able to keep up the pretense that we're supposed to keep up. We can't pretend anymore to ourselves or to anyone else. And this is a very great threat to everyone else who is playing the game successfully. This doesn't mean that we understand what's going on, because we don't see people as letting the side down by not pretending when they should be pretending. Because if we saw that, then we wouldn't be successfully pretending. So we can't allow ourselves to know the true reason why it is so disturbing for us to witness neurotic suffering. So we don't see the true reason at all. We just experience aversion and the need to discredit and dismiss the phenomenon of neuroticism. And we do that. We have done that in the past by saying it's a sickness. So the thing about a sickness is no matter what we do, it's only the sickness, and a sickness is a kind of an error thing. So it's like the machine is malfunctioning. So we're not going to take any interest in the particularities of the malfunction because it's just a malfunction. It can't tell us anything. And that is absolutely our cultural attitude towards mental health disturbances, particularly so with psychotic disturbances, because we really, really don't want to know what they're saying because it's just gobbledygook as far as we're concerned. There's nothing in it. It's just pure error messages coming out of the brain. Here's a malfunctioning brain. Here's a malfunctioning brain. But it isn't. We're labeling it as error, but it isn't error. It's something else. It's something else a lot more telling. So I'll go into what it is and what the thing is about psychosis. And another time. There is something about psychosis. There really is something that we don't want to look into. And this might be a reason why when we are dealing with people with mental illness, we're so very blinkered, we're so very rigid in our thinking, so very closed. We're not open to what they're saying. So we're dealing with people, and at the same time we're dismissing them, and at the same time we're saying that we're actually being client-centered, or that we're being unbiased. But we don't know how to be unbiased. We don't even know that we are unbiased. So this is a problem with stigma. We recognize that stigma is an appalling thing. It's an appalling thing to dismiss people as if their existence is of no consequence, or what they think or say is of no consequence, or much, much less important, to the point of not being important at all because they're kind of afflicted by something or other. We recognize that, so we try to legislate the lack of bias, but we don't really understand what lies behind the stigmatization of mental health conditions. And we don't want to. So how on earth can we ever resolve this question of stigma if we don't really want to look into it? So that's me waffling a bit, but the actual crux of it is to say what it is, what the pretense is, and what it is we don't want to see. So the basic idea is that the world we live in, which is the world that's created by thought, it's this thought-regulated world, the world that is mapped out by thought, presented by thought, classified by thought, validated by thought, is actually a place, it's unlivable because it's too sterile. There's nothing in it. it's a very tedious, it's like a tedious exercise in bureaucracy, or like a very tedious game that we could very easily get tired of playing. And so it's not just the world that we're living in, but it's us living in that world, because we live in that mind-created world as part of that mind-created world. So it's all the same cloth, really. So we're living in a sterile mind-created world as a sterile mind-created identity. That's a kind of a thing that it's pretty horrific to see, extremely horrific to see. Possibly it's the most horrific thing we could see. So obviously we don't want to see it. But how can we say this? What makes us, what gives us the right to come out with such an extreme statement? Because we certainly don't experience the type of a life we create for ourselves, the type of world we create for ourselves as being barren, lacking in any creativity or interest, just a continual rehash of what came before. We certainly don't perceive that. Or maybe we do. If we do perceive it, it affects us. We lose our gusto for life. But that's exactly when we get diagnosed with depression. But if depression somehow involves seeing something true about ourselves and something true about the world, that really does mean that we shouldn't be pathologizing it in the way that we do. It means that our pathologizing is itself pathological. And as it turns out, it doesn't involve a huge amount of intellectual running around the place to show that thought is sterile. And the best way to understand how thought is sterile is to think in terms of journeys. And we can think of two sorts of journeys. One sort of journey is moderated by thought. So that is a sort of journey which takes place always on the map, because thought doesn't believe anything that isn't on the map. The map is thought. Thought doesn't believe in anything that is beyond its remit. It can't do it. It's mechanically unable. So every journey that we take place within the thought-created world is a journey only from the point of view of thought. So thought says it's a journey because it maps everything else in gradations. So supposing I was traveling to a certain place, a certain location, and from where I am at the moment, which is also a location, now both of those are locations within thought, within my current way of understanding things. So I journey from here to there, but at no point have I ever departed from my current way of seeing things. That doesn't happen at all. I can say, okay, I've travelled 10 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet. But even no matter how far I travel, if I can measure the distance between where I am and where I'm going, what that actually means is where I am and where I'm going are exactly the same point, exactly the same place. There's been no change. Change can only take place when we go beyond measuring. So if our means of determining what change is and what travel is always measured by the ruler, then everything is just that ruler. A long distance is the same as a short distance. It's just more multiples of the basic standard, the basic ruler. There's no change. There's nothing new there. It's just more of the same. And our assumption is that everything is part of this continuum, this stretched out space that can be measured. That this traveling in a single direction, in a measurable way, will get me somewhere different. That is our assumption. But our experience in life is different. If we were to reflect on it, we'd say where there is a real experience, something that actually has got juice in it, it's actually something real has happened to us, is where we forget to measure, and somehow we make a jump from one universe to the next, and we can never retrace our steps and say, this is how I went from A to B by doing this and this and this, and then I turned left and then I did something else. In other words, there's no route map. Something happens, and in the thick of it all, in the thick of us transitioning, we forget to count, we forget to measure. And it's at that point that we go somewhere new, because our counting and our measuring is what stops us getting anywhere new, even though we obsessively count and measure the whole time and think that's what we have to do. In a very rough and ready way, you can think about it like traveling a long journey on a bus. And as long as we're thinking, okay, as long as we're clock watching, thinking, okay, I've done an hour, how much longer? Time seems to go on forever. But if we forget to watch the clock, something happens that we can't put a finger on, and then we find we're there because we weren't obsessively counting the miles or the hours or whatever. In other words, the watch kettle never boils. So don't watch the kettle. When we don't watch the kettle, when we're concentrating on something else rather than measuring, a transition takes place, because it can take place, because we're not obsessively holding on to our framework, which is the death of us. In other words, we're taking a risk, we're letting go. So out of this letting go of the framework, out of this risk-taking, actual change takes place. And actual change always involves a discontinuity. It's as if we've jumped from one alternative universe to the next, which we can never do on purpose, by deliberate, purposeful action, by measuring. This might sound quite fanciful, but in actual fact, ever since we've acknowledged complexity theory and chaos theory, this is the fundamental insight about the world we live in, that it is made up of discontinuities that we have to jump over, and which we can't jump over by tried and trusted methodological processes, by methods, shall I say. Because a method simply extends our starting off point. Any method, no matter how immensely complicated it might be, if it's a logical method, it's like I'm bringing my assumed world with me wherever I go. As long as there's a method, I'm extending my present location, I'm projecting it, and I'm never leaving it, I'm just extending it. Because there's no unknown, I'm extending the known, and if I'm extending the known, there is no change. So complexity theory shows how systems do jump from one dynamic regime to the next, but they do it via random fluctuations. They don't do it on purpose. They don't do it via a system. And that's how the world works, as we now know from the middle 1980s. Chaos is what articulates the universe in its journey, because chaos is what's really real, and the non-chaotic, the ordered or the orderly, is the mind-projected world that we like to dwell in, and we like to stick in, if we at all can. We love to stick within the continuum of thought, the logical continuum, because there's no risk in it. It's a risk-free zone. It's always the known. I never have to jump off the abyss into the radical unknown. And we can illustrate this by talking about Joseph Campbell's idea of the hero's journey. So what Joseph Campbell says is that the majority of us, the big majority of us, like to live within the playpen of everyday life, which is the known world. And we constantly validate this world to each other. And we say, this is all it is, this is all there is, rather, this is where it's at, nothing else exists. And even if some people may say that it does, they're fantasists, or they're dangerously unwell, or they're lying, or maybe if you happen to be of a religious bent, you could say that Satan, that's the devil's talk there. So if there is something else, that's just the devil, because we have to stick with the known. And that really is our psychological outlook. That is what creates the normal world, the equilibrium world, is our collusion in saying the known world is where it's at and it's important, and anything else is not important. This is what society is. It's very clear to see this is what society is. Talk about normal stuff with your normally socialized friends. They'll be happy to talk about it. Go off the grid. It's embarrassing, uncomfortable. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to go beyond the playpen. We don't want to go beyond the playpen. And because of this immense social collusion involving millions and millions of people, we're pretty much trapped because we can't make that leap of daring to imagine that there is more to life than this game that we're playing, which is pretty tedious, really. It's pretty tedious, but if it's all that there is, we'll get on with it. But if we saw that it's only a tiny little game, then it's not real anyway. It's just a little thing that we, little avoidance. So just our way of avoiding reality. If we could see that, not only would it be tedious to the nth degree, it would be intolerable. It jinx our game, in other words, it would spoil our game. So what Joseph Campbell says is that events occur in life that are of a dramatic or extreme or challenging nature, and that they will, by the fact that they are so extreme or challenging, push us out of the ordinary reality. And then we can't communicate about what's happening to us anymore. We can try, but people don't want to hear. We're not speaking their language. So they write us off and they say we're talking gibberish, or whatever way they might have of discounting us. So that's very challenging because we have to go beyond this immense support system, which is society. Not necessarily society as a whole, but just our local version of society, the people we know and relate to or meet. Because it is a collusion, because they are reinforcing this particular narrow view of reality, we're going against the grain in a serious way if we don't. To go against a collusion is to invite an awful lot of punishment. So from a personal point of view, it's very challenging for me to be in a radically unknown world. It's also very challenging to be ostracized by everyone and treated as an idiot. So it's doubly challenging. And the nature of this doubly challenging predicament that I'm in means that the odds are astronomically against me making this journey, and actually believing that it is a journey, that it is, in fact, it's the only journey we could ever make. As I was saying, the only journey we can ever make involves leaping across the abyss, leaping into radical uncertainty. That's the only type of journey there is. Anything else is a pseudo journey, a pretend journey that we like to say is a real journey because we're frightened. We're frightened of the real thing. Now, if we are frightened of the real thing, which is perfectly natural, and then we all collude together and say that real thing isn't a real thing and it doesn't exist anyway, and that the pseudo journey of life within the known realm is all there is, then we'll get on with it. As I was saying, we'll get on with it. We'll keep on imagining we're going to get the good stuff, the juice. We never will, because there is nothing in the mind-created world, in the world of the known. There's nothing in it. It's got no depth whatsoever because it isn't real. It's a construct. There's no flavour to a construct, there's no depth to a construct. So we just keep on thinking we're going to hit the nuggets. We're going to get the good stuff, but we never do. So it's based on the false promise, really, life and the game. In the game, we're promised that when we win, everything will be great. But winning is just another artifact of the game. It doesn't mean anything. It certainly doesn't mean going beyond the game. It just means it just reinforces the game to believe in winning in the game. And winning in the game is just as sterile as every other part of the game, because every little tiny bit of the game is totally sterile. It's not a real thing. It's just a little artificial situation that we create. So looking at things in this way, the mental health conditions and also extreme events in our lives, sickness or other events, propel us outside of the world of the known, outside of the playpen of consensus reality. So despite the fact that it's extraordinarily painful and challenging, that is where the possibility of real change, real growth exists. Not everyone will make this journey, very few will make this journey, but Joseph Campbell says those that do and manage to return bring something back of inestimable value to the rest of us that allows a kind of a healing or a growth to take place. So we really do need for this journey to be made, the hero's journey, as Joseph Campbell calls it. We rely on it because what those people bring who return from the hero's journey enriches our impoverished reality, and it needs enriching. We need someone to go out into the real world like that. This puts us in an odd situation, because although we do receive the benefit of the travellers who come back from the unknown, at the same time we totally discount them, and if we were to talk to them, we'd dismiss everything they say. And yet later on we will say, oh, aren't they great, and we'll pay lip service to them. But that's only from the point of view of that it's already happened, and therefore we can afford to say, yes, I was behind that. You wouldn't be the next time it happens. The next time we meet someone who's on that journey, we'll have no time for them. They have to somehow be accepted by everyone else for us to accept them. So that's a really ignominious situation. In other words, we treat our adventurers very badly indeed, and we celebrate them in retrospect, which is a total insult. It's kind of making out that we are part of that journey, but we weren't. We were on the other side. We were on the side of the people that were trying to say that the journey isn't a journey, and that they're stupid and that they're crazy, or whatever else we say. So there's this double attitude going on. So when we meet someone who's on the hero's journey, there's no way that we respect that fact and acknowledge that much, that no matter how difficult their experience, it is the hero's journey, it's a journey into actual reality out of the consensus reality. If we could do that, that in itself would be such a radically different approach. It wouldn't be stigmatizing. We may not be able to understand what these people are saying. We may not value we may not be able to get it, but we would realize that they are traveling on the hero's journey. But of course, it's no good me saying that, because we don't, because that's the whole point of the stigma that I started talking about. We just don't want to know. But it is this way of looking at things. It brings humanity to the whole thing, and instead of considering the experiences of people who are, for whatever reason, pushed out beyond the world of the known, instead of saying that those experiences are worthless, meaningless, with that they have no value, nothing of value in them. We wouldn't do that anymore. We wouldn't dismiss them in that way. We wouldn't ignore them in that way, which would feel a hell of a lot better. It would be a lot more supportive, and it would be to the benefit of all of us, really. Okay, thanks for watching.